You want to know how to build an aura so powerful that people stop themselves before they disrespect you. An energy so unmistakable that the room shifts the moment you walk in. Not because you're loud, not because you demand attention, but because your presence carries a weight that can't be ignored. And the truth is, most people spend their entire lives without ever touching that level of inner strength. They hide their power behind nervous laughter, quick explanations, and desperate attempts to be understood. But you're here because something inside you knows you were meant for more than that. You've tasted what it feels like to be underestimated, overlooked, dismissed, and a part of you refuses to let that story define you forever. There's a moment in every Stoic's life when they realize that the world doesn't respect noise. It respects discipline. It respects the person who doesn't break under pressure. It respects the one who masters their reactions, not the one who begs for validation. And once you understand this, once you begin shaping the force within you, your aura becomes something rare, calm, cold, unshakable. If you're ready to step into that version of yourself, if you're ready to build an aura forged from silence, clarity, and ruthless self-respect, then you're in the right place. Take a moment, breathe deeply, and commit to your own growth. Also consider subscribing. For the part of you that's tired of being reactive, tired of giving your power away, and ready to cultivate a mind guided by strength, wisdom, and Stoic discipline. There's a kind of power that doesn't announce itself, doesn't chase applause, and doesn't demand to be seen. It sits quietly beneath the surface, unshaken by noise, unmoved by chaos. This is inward certainty, the kind that doesn't just change how others see you, but how the world responds to you. When you stop trying to explain yourself, when you stop needing to be understood, you step into a different league of existence. Most people wander through life in reaction mode, tossed from one emotion to the next like leaves in the wind. But the moment you choose to anchor yourself, not to the approval of others, but to your own principles, that's when your aura begins to solidify. It becomes weight, not the kind that burdens you, but the kind that others feel, and often fear. Because when someone sees that you can stand still while everything else trembles, it challenges their entire sense of control. They don't know what to do with you. You don't explain your silence. You don't rush to fill the gaps. And because they don't understand you, they start imagining you know something they don't. That discomfort makes them tread carefully. They begin projecting their doubts, their insecurities, their fears onto your calm. And without saying a word, you become the mirror they can't look away from. This is the root of all real influence. Not dominance, not noise, but a deep, disciplined stillness that says, I do not need to move for the world. I choose when and how the world moves around me. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The tranquility that comes when you stop caring what they say, or think, or do. Only what you do." That's not just a philosophy, that's a strategy. Because when your attention is no longer scattered, your presence becomes focused, and your focus becomes a force. You stop being predictable. You stop being accessible in the way you once were, and people feel it immediately. Conversations change, interactions shift. Even silence starts to work in your favor. Not because you're cold, but because you are composed. You become the person whose opinion carries weight, not because it's loud, but because it's rare and considered. That kind of power doesn't come from showing off. It comes from showing up to your own life with a level of certainty that's been earned in private. And that's what most people never understand. Real power isn't something you shout about. It's something you build layer by layer when no one's watching. In the moments when you could break, but choose not to. When you could react, but choose stillness. When you could compromise, but choose clarity. And if you want others to respect you without needing to demand it, you must first master the art of respecting your own silence, your own path, your own conviction, because people only follow those who look like they know where they're going. And to know where you're going, you must first know who you are, not in some grand philosophical way, but in the small, daily moments of restraint, in the quiet decisions that no one claps for, in the choices that keep you aligned with something greater than opinion. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But you cannot become who you truly are if you're still performing for people who don't even know themselves. So ask yourself, what do you believe in when no one is looking? What do you hold on to when the world tries to bend you? If your values can be shaken by opinions, they're not values, they're preferences. And preferences don't build empires, convictions do. Your aura, the energy people feel around you, is not shaped in the spotlight. It's shaped in solitude, in your willingness to be misunderstood, to walk away when it's easier to stay, to choose principles over popularity, and to choose self-respect over short-term approval. Epictetus reminded us, "Seek not the good in external things, seek it in yourselves." That's not just advice for quiet moments. That's a blueprint for every moment. Because once you stop outsourcing your sense of worth, you become immovable, not stubborn, not inflexible, but rooted. And in a world that moves fast, loud, and without direction, being rooted is intimidating. People don't understand those who don't flinch, those who don't overshare, those who don't follow trends. But that's precisely why they're drawn to them. Your certainty gives them something to orbit around, not because you're perfect, but because you are centered. Centered in your mission, centered in your values, centered in your ability to observe without being absorbed. When you're grounded, your presence is no longer about what you say or do. It's about who you are. It radiates in your posture, your pacing, your gaze. And the more intentional you become, the more your silence becomes persuasive. That's the paradox. In chasing nothing, you begin to attract everything, not in a desperate way, but in a quiet way that makes others adjust their behavior without realizing why. Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. And most of what we waste is given away in reaction, reacting to gossip, criticism, insecurity, pressure. But what if you stopped reacting? What if you held your ground even when the world tried to shake you? Then you become untouchable, not invincible, but emotionally and mentally sovereign. You are no longer ruled by the winds of external drama. You are guided by something internal, something sacred. And over time, that creates an aura people respect, even if they don't fully understand it. It makes you unpredictable in the best way. And most importantly, it makes you trustworthy, not because you say all the right things, but because people can feel that your strength comes from a place they can't shake. And when you walk into a room like that, the room notices, even if no one can quite put into words why. This is the beginning, not of pretending to be powerful, but of becoming unshakable. And unshakable doesn't mean hard. It means clear. It means precise. It means choosing what matters and letting everything else pass like clouds in the sky. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living, but the undisciplined mind is not worth following. So discipline your thoughts, anchor your soul, stand like a mountain in a world of waves, and eventually you'll realize you don't need to chase power. You just need to stop giving yours away. Because the most powerful aura is the one that doesn't need to prove itself. It simply exists. And people feel it. There's a subtle kind of power that doesn't roar. It resists. It resists the urge to explain, to justify, to react just because someone else expects it. That kind of restraint creates an invisible force field, one that few can understand but everyone feels. When you master the discipline of withholding your reactions, you begin to change how people treat you. You are no longer the one who dances to the rhythm of someone else's drama. You become the one who sets the tone simply by choosing not to play the game they're trying to drag you into. And that choice, though it seems passive, is anything but. It is the most active form of self-control there is. Because anyone can shout back when they're insulted. Anyone can rush to defend themselves when they feel misunderstood. But not everyone can sit in the heat of discomfort and let silence speak louder than emotion. Most people reveal themselves in moments of pressure. They overtalk when someone challenges them. They explain too much, too fast, just to feel safe again. They want to be understood more than they want to be respected. And that craving becomes a weakness. But the moment you stop trying to be understood by those who don't deserve that effort, you take back a piece of your power. The less you give away your emotional energy, the more valuable your presence becomes. You stop being predictable. You stop being emotionally available in ways that get exploited. And people don't know what to do with that. When you no longer flinch, no longer rush to explain yourself, no longer validate every glance thrown your way, you disrupt the entire dynamic of control. They expect you to argue. You remain calm. They expect you to clarify. You let the misunderstanding sit. They expect a reaction. And all they get is silence. That's when their confidence begins to crack. Not because you attacked, but because you didn't respond. And nothing is more unsettling than someone who doesn't react the way you planned. You become untouchable, not because you're distant or cold, but because you're grounded. Because your emotions are not on public display for others to poke and prod. And that unsettles people. They start adjusting their words around you, choosing their tone more carefully, trying to earn the reaction you used to give away freely. But you don't give it anymore, because you finally understand that your reaction is a gift, not a right. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But the reverse is also true. Everything that people try to irritate in you is often a reflection of what they haven't yet mastered in themselves. So when someone tries to provoke you, it's rarely about you. It's about their inability to handle your stillness. Your quiet control reminds them of their own chaos. And instead of owning it, they try to pass it on to you through insult, through mockery, through manipulation. But when you don't take the bait, you don't absorb the chaos. You stay with yourself. And that changes everything. It's not about being passive. It's about being precise. It's not about being indifferent. It's about being intentional. Your reaction should never be automatic. It should be earned. It should be chosen. Because when you react to everything, you waste energy. But when you respond only to what truly matters, your energy becomes focused, sharp enough to cut through noise, clear enough to lead. And that clarity is rare. It makes people trust you more, respect you more, follow you without needing to be convinced. Because restraint signals strength. And strength, when it doesn't need to prove itself, commands attention without a single word. There's also a kind of peace that comes from not being emotionally hijacked by every opinion thrown your way. You realize you don't owe everyone a response. You don't owe them your energy. You don't owe them access to your emotional state. You are allowed to sit with discomfort. You are allowed to let others misunderstand you without needing to correct them. You are allowed to say nothing and still hold the upper hand. Seneca said, "If a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable. And if you don't know what you stand for, you'll be moved by every gust of criticism, every jab of insecurity, every petty remark dressed as concern." But once you decide that your peace is not up for negotiation, the world begins to shift. Not because it changed, but because your posture did. Your energy is no longer reactive, it's reserved. And people feel it. They don't say it out loud, but they begin to respect it. They see that you are not here to perform for their comfort. You are here to live from your values. That stillness you hold, it becomes authority. That pause before responding, it becomes mystery. That silence in the face of provocation, it becomes power. And over time, those who once tested you begin to tread lightly, not because you threatened them, but because they realize they can't move you. You are no longer swayed by tone. You are not baited by mockery. You are not destabilized by urgency. You respond when you choose. And that choice, made over and over again, builds a reputation stronger than any speech you could deliver. Plato once said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something." The same applies to reaction. When you react only when it matters, your reactions carry weight. They shape dynamics, they alter outcomes. But when you react to everything, your influence dissolves into noise. So train yourself, not to suppress emotion, but to control its release, to sit in the discomfort of silence, to hold the line when everything in you wants to lash out, to breathe when the world pushes for you to break. And you'll notice something remarkable. You'll feel more centered, more powerful, more calm in the storm. And people will notice too. They'll sense that you're not playing their emotional games anymore. And when they realize they can't provoke you, they'll start respecting you, or fearing you, or both. Because in a world that feeds on reactions, the one who doesn't flinch becomes the one who leads. But more than that, it's whether you choose to react at all. Let others rush to be seen. Let them scramble for attention. You move with intention. You stay still. You withhold. And in doing so, you build something they can't define, but can't ignore either. That's power, not in noise, but in control. Not in aggression, but in precision. Not in proving, but in choosing. And the more you choose silence over reaction, clarity over chaos, intention over impulse, the more your presence begins to shape the room before you've even said a word. Power doesn't come from being cold. It comes from being composed. There's a big difference. Anyone can pretend they don't care, put on a mask, numb themselves, act detached. But that's not strength. That's avoidance. True power lies in feeling everything fully, yet choosing not to be ruled by any of it. You can feel anger boiling beneath your skin and still not raise your voice. You can feel fear crawling up your spine and still hold your ground. You can feel desire surging through your chest and still not chase. Because control doesn't mean cutting yourself off from emotion. It means becoming so familiar with your inner world that nothing in it surprises you anymore. You stop being reactive because nothing inside you catches you off guard. Most people live at the mercy of their emotions. They ride every wave. They get pulled into every tide. Joy makes them reckless. Fear makes them freeze. And rejection makes them crumble. But once you learn to sit with your emotions without being swallowed by them, you start to change. You begin to respond instead of react. And in that gap, in that pause where others would spiral, you gain the upper hand. You become the calm in the middle of chaos, the person who doesn't flinch, doesn't beg, doesn't break. And people notice. They might not know what it is, but they feel it. Your stillness unsettles them. Your clarity calms them. Your restraint earns their respect. And all of it comes from one simple truth. You are no longer ruled by what you feel. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Emotional mastery begins the moment you stop outsourcing your behavior to feelings you haven't examined. If you lash out when you're angry, shrink when you're anxious, or chase when you're lonely, then your emotions are writing the script. And you're just performing. But when you bring awareness to what moves inside you, When you pause long enough to see the fear beneath the anger or the grief beneath the pride, you start regaining control. You begin choosing instead of reacting. And that choice is what separates leaders from followers, creators from reactors, calm presences from chaotic ones. And it doesn't mean you don't feel deeply. In fact, you probably feel more than most. But you don't perform those feelings for attention. You don't hand them over like currency to people who haven't earned access to them. You hold them, you study them, you understand them like tools, and then you decide how and when to use them. That's what makes your presence so powerful. Because in a world where everyone is spilling their emotions into every conversation, you become the rare one who filters first, who processes before speaking, who chooses silence when words would only serve your ego. And that silence carries weight. It creates tension. It makes people listen more closely when you finally do speak. Not because you're suppressing, but because you're refined. When you are emotionally disciplined, people start leaning on you during chaos. Not because you asked for that role, but because you've become the only one still thinking clearly. And clarity is rare. In an argument, you don't raise your voice, you lower it. In discomfort, you don't escape, you breathe deeper. In failure, you don't collapse, you recalibrate. And slowly, others start turning toward you, even if they don't admit it. Because stability is magnetic, it's grounding. And in a world where people are so easily triggered, the one who isn't becomes the one others follow, even if they don't understand why. You also stop being easy to manipulate. You don't chase approval anymore, so compliments don't control you. You don't fear rejection anymore, so disapproval doesn't destabilize you. And when someone tries to provoke you, they're met with stillness, not fire. That's the advantage. You are no longer moved by cheap tactics. You see through them, you've outgrown them. And because of that, others can't play you the way they used to. They can't make you feel small just to feel bigger themselves. They can't trigger your old insecurities, because those triggers have been disarmed, not by force, but by awareness. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The strength he speaks of isn't just about resisting hardship. It's about mastering the battlefield inside you. Because once that's done, no external war can break you. You've already faced the enemy within and made peace with it. You know how to sit with anger without being consumed. You know how to notice envy without letting it rot your spirit. You know how to recognize sadness without letting it drown you. And that level of awareness becomes your edge, your advantage, your armor. But emotional mastery doesn't mean being numb. It means being alive in a different way, more grounded, more aware, more intentional. You still laugh, you still cry, you still feel deeply, but those emotions don't dictate your choices. They inform them. You listen, then lead. You feel, then act. And that sequence, feel, reflect, then respond, is what separates power from chaos. Because it's not emotion that weakens people, it's the inability to manage it. And once you show others that you've made peace with your inner world, you start commanding respect without even asking for it. The truth is, emotional control is not about locking yourself in a cage. It's about knowing when to open the door. You become someone who can use anger to assert boundaries without exploding. Someone who can feel sadness without collapsing under its weight. Someone who can experience desire without being dragged behind it. And that balance is where your strength grows, because you're no longer flinching from what you feel. You're learning from it, using it, sharpening it into wisdom. And you begin to notice who hasn't done that work. The people who gossip when they're insecure. The ones who yell when they feel unheard. The ones who shut down instead of speak clearly. You see their behavior not as personal attacks, but as signs of emotional immaturity. And instead of being pulled into their storm, you become the one who keeps their center, who doesn't get baited, who stays steady, because nothing they throw at you finds a grip anymore. You don't owe anyone your reactivity. You don't owe them your emotional energy just because they want to see you flinch. You've learned to breathe, to observe, to choose, and that choice is everything. It's what separates someone who's easily manipulated from someone who is respected, even feared, not because of aggression, but because of control. Seneca said, "Most powerful is he who has himself in his own power." And once you do, no one else really holds any. So when you walk into a room now, you carry more than confidence. You carry self-command, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, the kind that doesn't rise and fall based on how others treat you, the kind that radiates from the inside out, quiet, composed, powerful, because you're no longer seeking control over others. You found something far greater, control over yourself. And that is the kind of power people feel before you even speak. Power is not always about what you show. Sometimes it's about what you don't. In a world obsessed with exposure, with emotional transparency and performative authenticity, there's something deeply unsettling about a person who cannot be read, who doesn't give away their hand, their mood, their next move. That unreadability makes people pause. It interrupts patterns, because when they can't calculate your reaction, they lose the ability to control the interaction. And that shift, that discomfort, is where the leverage begins. Not through deception or manipulation, but through restraint, through the conscious decision to remain composed, still, intentional. The ones who are always expressing, always explaining, always giving a peek behind the curtain. Those are the ones who are easiest to manage. They don't realize that every emotional cue, every visible trigger, every outburst is a breadcrumb for someone else to follow and eventually use. If you want to hold control in a conversation, in a relationship, in any dynamic where power matters, you have to become the unknown variable, not cold, not distant, but grounded in a way that makes your silence more influential than their words. That's when people stop trying to provoke you, because they start fearing what they can't predict. This kind of presence is built through discipline. It's forged in those small moments where you'd usually react, correct someone, justify yourself, make a sarcastic jab, and instead you pause, you breathe, you withhold. Not to suppress, but to choose. Because unpredictability doesn't mean erratic behavior, it means controlled mystery. You're not trying to confuse people, you're choosing not to hand over the map. And in a world that constantly demands access, denying that access becomes a form of silent power. It creates an invisible boundary. You don't get to know what moves me, and when people realize they can't read you, they become cautious. Not out of fear, but out of respect for what might be beneath the surface. Aristotle once said, "He who cannot be a good follower cannot be a good leader." But what he didn't need to say, because it's self-evident, is that no one follows someone they fully understand. There has to be some mystery, some distance, not deception, mystery, that subtle space between what others want to know and what you choose to reveal. That space is where influence lives, because when people can't place you in a box, they can't reduce you. And what they can't reduce, they start to admire or fear. Either outcome works in your favor. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally unavailable. It means being emotionally sovereign. You still feel, you just don't put every feeling on display, like a public announcement. You still care. You just don't let that care be manipulated. You still react internally, but you make a conscious decision about whether the world deserves to see that reaction. And that kind of choice makes people pay closer attention. They listen when you speak because you don't speak to fill space. They watch how you move because you don't move just to be seen. That quiet confidence creates a sense of gravity. It draws people in, even as it keeps them guessing. Unreadability isn't about being fake, it's about being deep. Most people operate on the surface. They live out loud because silence terrifies them. They overshare because they're afraid of being misunderstood. But when you're secure in yourself, when you know what you stand for, you don't need to perform. You don't need to constantly clarify your intentions. Your stillness speaks louder than their explanations ever could. And that stillness becomes a test. Who can handle the fact that they don't fully know you? Who can sit with the discomfort of not being able to read your emotions like a billboard? Epictetus taught that if someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. In other words, if people can control you through your emotions, it's not their power, it's your lack of restraint. And the antidote isn't detachment, it's refinement. It's the conscious act of guarding your expressions, your signals, your vulnerabilities, not to hide, but to protect the parts of yourself that must remain sovereign. Because when you give people too much access to your inner world, you also give them the tools to disturb it. But when you remain composed, even when you're stirred internally, you retain the one thing that all influence depends on: control over perception. It's not about being unreadable for the sake of power. It's about being unreadable so your power isn't diluted. Because the moment you become predictable, you become vulnerable, not emotionally but strategically. If people know exactly what to say to get under your skin, they own a part of you. But when you're calm, consistent, and quietly unreadable, they're left with nothing to latch onto. They're forced to deal with you as you are, not as a sum of your visible reactions, but as a steady force that does not bend for their comfort. Over time, this changes how others treat you. They come to understand that their usual tactics don't work. They stop trying to guilt you into things. They stop using flattery to sway you. They stop provoking, because provoking you doesn't lead anywhere. And that silence you hold, that calm expression, that slow, deliberate speech, it becomes your edge. They learn to approach you differently because they know there's more to you than what you show. That's not manipulation. That's dignity. That's self-respect turned outward. Carl Jung once said, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know." That applies both inwardly and outwardly. You become unreadable not just because you withhold, but because you're constantly evolving. You're not stuck in one role, one emotion, one version of yourself. So even if someone thinks they've figured you out, they're wrong the next day. You're not a statue, they are. You move, you reflect, you grow. And that movement makes it impossible for others to pin you down. Not because you're evasive, but because you're dynamic. You've developed layers, and people don't know which layer they're going to meet. Eventually, this becomes your default posture. Calm, watchful, controlled. You don't let others see behind the curtain unless you choose to. You don't react just because someone's watching. You don't explain just because someone's confused. You move through the world with a quiet force that others learn to respect without fully understanding. And that's the point. You don't need to be understood to be powerful. You just need to stop giving away your predictability. Once you do, you stop being a piece in other people's games and start becoming the one who defines the board. Words aren't just sounds, they're signals, and most people waste them. They talk because silence makes them uncomfortable. They explain too much because they want to be liked. They ramble, hoping something they say will land. But all that noise does the opposite. It weakens the message, it dilutes the presence. And over time, the more someone speaks without precision, the more invisible they become. But when you learn to hold your words, to use them intentionally, to speak not to be heard but to be remembered, you start to shift how people respond to you. You begin to carry a presence that doesn't need volume to be felt. It's not how loud you speak, it's how clear your silence is before you do. There's a certain gravity that surrounds someone who speaks with purpose. When they open their mouth, people stop. Not because they command attention, but because they've trained everyone around them to associate their voice with value. That's the difference. Not everyone needs to hear you, but when you speak, the right ones will. And they'll listen closer, not just to your words, but to what you choose not to say. Because restraint makes your presence sharper. People notice when you're deliberate. They notice when you skip the unnecessary. And they respect you more because of it. Precision is more than just being careful. It's being sovereign over your communication. It's deciding that not every thought needs an audience. Not every feeling needs a microphone. The truth is, most people fear silence. They fill it with words to avoid the weight of their own presence. But if you're grounded, if you've done the inner work, you don't run from silence. You use it. You let it stretch. You let it create tension. And when you finally break that silence, your words echo in a way that others don't. Because you didn't just speak, you delivered. And people remember that. The quiet ones who only speak when it matters aren't forgettable. They're unforgettable. Because in a world of constant noise, clarity is power. Seneca once said, "Speech that's true and unadorned, clear and without ambiguity, commands more respect than a fine show of words." What he understood was that elegance comes not from decoration, but from discipline, from cutting away the excess, from knowing that the sharpest blade is the one that has been carefully forged, honed, and used sparingly. When you treat your words like tools, not toys, they begin to carry weight, and that weight shapes perception. Suddenly people find themselves thinking twice about what you say, not because you said it loudly, but because you said it with certainty. The same applies to your tone. You don't need to raise your voice to assert yourself. In fact, the lower and calmer your tone, the more seriously people take you. When others panic, you breathe. When others shout, you stay steady, and that contrast makes them recalibrate. Because nothing disrupts noise like stillness, and nothing disarms aggression like calm confidence. Your words become more than speech. They become a mirror, a moment of clarity that reflects back everything others are missing in their own minds. And for a few seconds, you become the person they trust, not because you told them what they wanted to hear, but because you gave them what they needed to understand. There's also a kind of respect that grows from the way you speak to yourself. If your internal dialogue is sharp, precise, clean, you begin carrying that same clarity into your external conversations. You don't overpromise, you don't flatter, you don't use words to control how others see you. You use words to align with how you truly see yourself. And that integrity shows. The more authentic your language becomes, the more others feel that they're not just hearing you, they're seeing you. And in a world full of empty talk, that level of honesty is rare. And rare things are always valuable. Carl Jung wrote, "Words ought to be a little wild, for they are the assaults of thoughts on the unthinking." What he was getting at is this: real speech, the kind that cuts through confusion, requires courage. Precision is not about being robotic. It's about being brave enough to say the thing that matters, without softening it for the comfort of others. It's about piercing through layers of falsehood, not to attack, but to awaken. And when you speak from that place, not to manipulate, not to charm, but to reveal, you shift the emotional temperature in any room you walk into. People will often try to provoke you just to get a reaction. They want you to overshare. They want you to argue. They want you to stumble into a trap made of your own words. But if you've trained yourself to respond slowly, clearly, and with restraint, they lose their grip. They can't control what they can't anticipate. And if you pause before you speak, especially when emotions are high, You break their rhythm. They get confused. They wonder what you're thinking. They start filling in the blanks, and suddenly you're not playing their game anymore. You're watching from above it. Even the way you decline something can reveal your strength. A simple "no, thank you," spoken calmly, says more than a paragraph of excuses. A quiet "I disagree," delivered with steady breath, has more impact than shouting over someone, because your control communicates boundaries. It says, "I do not need to explain myself to be clear. I do not need to raise my voice to be heard. I do not need to speak often to be respected." That's the weapon of precision. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It's clean. It's sharp. It's surgical. Aristotle once noted that the more you know, the less you need to say. And that principle lives in every interaction you have. You don't need to overshare to feel seen. You don't need to justify your decisions to feel secure. You don't need to fill every silence to feel relevant. When you speak from a place of truth and control, your words become rare currency. And like any rare currency, people start treating them with more value. They listen more carefully. They pause before responding. They adjust their energy around you, and not because you demanded it, but because you earned it. Eventually, this becomes a lifestyle. You begin moving through your day with intention. You send fewer messages, but they land deeper. You have shorter conversations, but they linger longer. You give fewer opinions, but they shape the room. And you realize that language isn't just a method of communication, it's a mirror of who you are. When you choose your words carefully, you shape not just the perception others have of you, but the standard they hold themselves to in your presence. Precision is a discipline. It's something you build slowly, through observation, through silence, through discomfort. But the reward is profound, because in mastering your words, you begin mastering your presence. And in mastering your presence, you begin mastering the influence you carry in the minds of others. You become unforgettable, not because you talk more than others, but because you said less and meant more. Real presence has nothing to do with theatrics. It's not about entering a room with exaggerated gestures or being the loudest voice at the table. It's about something much quieter, much deeper. True presence is when people feel you before you speak, when the air seems to shift, not because of what you're doing, but because of who you're being. You don't walk into a room to be noticed. You walk in already knowing that your existence carries weight. You don't need to perform. You don't need to chase reactions, because you're not seeking approval. You're simply grounded. And in that grounding, others sense a difference they can't quite name, but they can't ignore either. Most people move with a kind of anxiety buried just beneath the surface. They fidget. They scan faces for reactions. They try to adjust themselves mid-sentence to please whoever is in front of them. It's subtle, but it's visible. And it's rooted in the belief that their worth must be proven moment to moment. That's performance. And the tragedy is, performance always weakens presence. The more effort you put into trying to seem confident, the less real confidence you actually radiate. But when you walk with your shoulders back, when your steps are slow and intentional, when your voice doesn't rush to fill silence, that's presence. It tells people, I'm not here to earn space, I'm here because I belong. That sense of belonging starts internally. It's not about arrogance or inflated self-worth. It's about knowing who you are without needing to constantly prove it. Even the way you sit can change a room. Upright, not rigid, relaxed, not slouched. It's a posture that speaks, I don't need to shrink myself to be accepted, and I don't need to puff myself up to be respected. That balance is rare, and that rarity is what makes it powerful. It's the absence of neediness. It's the energy of someone who's already self-approved. And in a world where everyone is trying to impress, Someone who simply is becomes unforgettable. This doesn't mean you're passive or disengaged. It means you engage on your terms. You speak when you're ready. You listen fully. You don't rush to be heard because you trust that what you say will matter when it's said. Your timing is deliberate, your tone is steady, and your silence. That becomes its own kind of voice. It carries meaning. It makes people wait, not because they're impatient, but because they know when you speak, it will be worth it. That's the kind of presence that doesn't need applause. It changes the rhythm of the room. Don't talk about confidence. Don't try to signal power. Just be someone who no longer performs for it. People will feel that, and they'll remember it, because there's a subtle but undeniable strength in someone who doesn't need their presence to be validated. They walk in, and others naturally yield, not out of fear, but out of respect for the force they're witnessing. This is the energy of someone who's done the internal work, who's faced their insecurities, not covered them with charm or noise, who's learned to sit with discomfort without trying to fix it through external validation. You carry yourself differently when your self-worth doesn't depend on how others perceive you. Your movements slow down, your words become more exact, your breathing becomes calmer, and that calm becomes contagious. It starts guiding the emotional tone of the environment around you. You become the anchor in conversations, the center of gravity in the social dynamic. People look to you, not because you're the loudest or the most charismatic, but because you're the most centered. That steadiness is rare, and rare becomes powerful when it's embodied consistently. There's a rhythm to how you operate, and it doesn't speed up to match the chaos of others. You stay in your pace, and that pace begins to shape the pace of those around you. People often confuse presence with charisma, but charisma is something you project. Presence is something you become. It doesn't depend on personality. It depends on posture, energy, and attention. Are you fully here? Are you speaking because you have something meaningful to say, or because silence makes you nervous? Are you listening because you care, or just waiting for your turn to talk? These are small things, but presence is built in the small things. And eventually, you reach a point where you don't even think about it. You're not monitoring yourself. You're not wondering how you're coming across. You're just present, fully, unapologetically, peacefully present. And that presence becomes your signature. Not a performance, not a costume, but an extension of your integrity. The way you carry yourself becomes the message. You don't have to convince anyone that you're valuable. They feel it, not because you told them, but because you stopped needing to. Presence without performance is about coming home to yourself. It's about no longer looking outward for cues on how to be. It's about knowing that stillness, not noise, is what leaves the deepest impression. Socrates once said, "Be as you wish to seem." And when you live like that, when there is no gap between your inner world and how you move through the outer one, people trust you. They may not always understand you, but they respect you, because you don't change to fit the room. You remain steady, and the room changes around you. And in that quiet, powerful shift, you stop trying to make an impact. You become the impact. Scarcity is not about playing games. It's not about withholding to manipulate others or being distant just to create tension. It's about understanding something deeper, something psychological, even primal. We value what we don't always have access to. What's rare, we protect. What's constant, we overlook. And this applies to people just as much as it does to objects, opportunities, or ideas. You don't have to be everywhere to make an impact. In fact, the more often you show up without intention, the more likely people are to take your presence for granted. When you're always available, always explaining, always responding, you start to fade into the background. But when you're deliberate, when you give your presence like it's something precious, suddenly people pay attention. You don't need to vanish or isolate yourself to become scarce. You need to move with purpose. You need to speak only when the moment calls for it, not because you're afraid of being forgotten. That fear of being irrelevant, of being misunderstood, of being left behind, that's what drives most people to overexpose themselves. But what they don't realize is that in their constant need to be seen, they lose the very thing they're trying to build: gravity, presence, respect. Scarcity is the art of choosing your moments wisely. Let people wonder where you are. Let them miss your energy, your thoughts, your input. That quiet distance builds mystique, and mystique, when grounded in authenticity, turns ordinary presence into power. Carl Jung once observed, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." And that truth echoes deeply in this context. When you make yourself constantly available just to feel less alone or more significant, you often dilute the very message you're trying to share. But when you speak or act only from the space of alignment, when you choose not to explain every thought, not to defend every silence, you start attracting people who feel the depth in what you withhold. They start listening more closely. They read into your pauses, your absence, your brevity, and in doing so, they begin to value every small moment they get from you. It's not just about appearing mysterious, it's about becoming intentional. The person who never stops talking is rarely remembered, but the one who speaks once and speaks with clarity leaves echoes. Scarcity amplifies your impact. When you're not always around, people notice when you are. When you don't always share your thoughts, your words hit deeper when you do. You become a presence that carries weight, not because you push, but because you pull back. Because you understand timing. Not everything must be said now. Not every room must be filled with your voice. Not every request deserves a response. There's a kind of quiet strength in the person who doesn't rush to fill silence, who doesn't flood others with their energy, who gives just enough to spark curiosity and then steps back. That's where influence lives, not in flooding people with attention, but in letting them wonder where yours has gone. Because when your attention becomes a reward, not a default, people shift. They adjust their tone. They rethink their words. They become more deliberate around you, not because you told them to, but because the rarity of your energy demands more care. Seneca once wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving." This speaks not just to who you allow into your life, but how often you allow them access. If you're always giving yourself to everyone without boundaries or filters, you start to lose the sense of discernment that gives your presence power. Scarcity teaches you to measure your moments, to be intentional with your time, your energy, your presence. Not everyone deserves full access to you. Not everyone has earned the right to know what you're thinking. And when you realize that, you stop explaining so much. You stop broadcasting your every move. You move in silence, not out of fear, but out of power. And in that silence, something remarkable happens. People start talking. They speculate. They interpret. They feel your absence more than they ever acknowledged your presence. Because when you're no longer available on demand, your energy becomes something people have to earn. And that shift creates influence. They remember your words longer. They revisit your advice more often. They try to recreate your presence when you're gone. Not because you're playing hard to get, but because you've become someone worth getting close to. Even in relationships, this principle applies. Constant reassurance, constant presence, constant giving. It creates comfort, yes, but also complacency. But when you maintain a sense of individuality, When you preserve your boundaries, when you allow space in the dynamic, you protect your value. You remind others that your time and energy are not infinite, not automatic, not owed. And in doing that, you don't create distance, you create desire. People begin to appreciate what they almost overlooked. They start choosing their words more carefully. They show up differently, not because you demanded it, but because your absence revealed what your presence was actually worth. And the best part is this: scarcity doesn't require performance. You don't have to pretend to be busy or feign disinterest or play cold. You just need to prioritize depth over display, quality over frequency, intention over exposure. And when you do, your relationships evolve. Your reputation expands. People remember you for what you gave, and even more for what you didn't. You become someone whose presence lingers long after the moment ends. Someone whose silence speaks louder than another person's shouting. Epictetus once said, "Know first who you are, and then adorn yourself accordingly." That adornment is not in physical things, it's in how you manage your energy, your words, your presence. Scarcity is the decision to protect your power by not scattering it. It's the understanding that not all visibility leads to value, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back, stay quiet, move with subtlety, and let your absence do the talking. Eventually, you'll realize something profound. You don't need to keep reminding people you exist. You don't need to stay in the spotlight to stay relevant. When you build yourself in silence, when you cultivate a presence that doesn't rely on performance or frequency, you become someone others look for, not someone they scroll past. You become rare, and rare always has value. You become the kind of person whose time feels like a gift, whose words feel like insight, whose presence feels like peace. Not because you said it, but because you lived it. That is the art of scarcity. Not to retreat from the world, but to rise above the noise by knowing when not to show up, when to let your silence hold the space, when to let your absence speak your value. Power doesn't always announce itself through presence or words. It often reveals itself in boundaries, and not just soft ones drawn in sand, but sharp, unmistakable lines that sting when crossed. If your time, your energy, your emotional bandwidth is available to anyone who asks, then your presence loses its weight. People sense when they can walk in and out of your life without resistance. They sense when your tolerance is limitless. And in that sensing, they stop valuing what they once admired. Because true power isn't only about what you give, it's about what you deny, the energy you don't chase, the disrespect you don't entertain, the access you don't grant twice. Setting boundaries isn't about building walls to push people away. It's about protecting the standards that guard your peace, your purpose, your focus. When you operate with clear internal rules about how you expect to be treated, how you spend your time, how you protect your energy, you stop being moved by every request or manipulated by every guilt trip. You no longer need to explain why you said no. You don't give long apologies for needing space. You don't soften your decisions just to make others more comfortable. Because power doesn't ask for permission to exist. It holds its ground. People will test you. They always do. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes subconsciously. They'll cross small lines first, speak to you differently, ask for more than they give, ignore your silence, take your kindness for weakness. And if you don't respond with clarity, they'll assume those lines were imaginary. That's why enforcement matters more than declaration. You don't have to warn someone twice. You don't need to threaten. All you need to do is act, quietly, immediately, without emotional fireworks. Because the more you explain your boundaries, the more negotiable they sound. But when you enforce them without apology, People learn fast. They don't always like it, but they remember it. And respect often follows where comfort ends. There's a kind of fear that comes from unpredictability, but there's another deeper kind that comes from consistency. When people know that disrespect is always met with consequence, not emotional outbursts, not dramatic exits, but calm withdrawal or firm distance, they begin to regulate themselves around you. They begin to consider their tone, their words, their behavior, not because you control them, but because you've mastered control of your own space, and space becomes sacred when it's not freely given. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but it's just as terrifying for others when they meet someone who has done that work. Because once you've accepted yourself, once you've taken full ownership of your boundaries, no one else gets to write the rules. You stop needing approval to protect your peace. You stop fearing the loss of people who can't respect your standards. And instead of feeling guilty for holding the line, you feel stronger, sharper, lighter. Because you've trimmed the emotional weight of tolerating what drains you. You've chosen clarity over connection, and that choice begins to reshape your relationships. The ones who are meant to stay will respect your lines and rise to meet them. The ones who were there to use you will resist and eventually fall away. Either way, you win, because the life that's built around clear boundaries is always more peaceful than the one built around constant compromise. Weak people think saying yes is what keeps things together. They confuse agreement with harmony, but strong people know that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is no, not with malice, not with bitterness, just with truth. The kind of truth that's not up for debate. When you say no without guilt, when you walk away without hesitation, when you detach from what no longer respects you, your energy changes, your face changes, your posture changes. You stop shrinking to fit people who were never meant to sit at your table, and in that shift, you become untouchable, not because you're guarded, but because you're no longer accessible by default. Boundaries aren't just for protecting you from others. They're also for protecting you from your weaker self. The version of you that wants to please, that wants to avoid conflict, that wants to be liked more than respected. Discipline isn't just in your schedule or your habits. It's in how you allow others to treat you. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you train yourself to betray your own needs. Every time you let something slide just to avoid discomfort, you teach your mind that peace must be earned through silence. But when you reverse that, when you act the moment a line is crossed, you rewire your relationship with power. You learn that peace doesn't come from pleasing others. It comes from protecting your standards. You can't control how people act, but you can control what you accept. You can't control if someone disrespects you, but you can control how long you let them stay in your life after they do. Boundaries sting because they carry consequence. And consequence is what separates warnings from rules. People may resist, they may push, they may guilt. But your consistency will outlast their manipulation. Eventually, those around you adapt. They either meet your standard or they move away from it. And both outcomes serve you, not out of selfishness, but out of alignment. Because life becomes infinitely clearer when you don't negotiate your values in the face of temporary discomfort. You become someone who others respect, not just for your presence, but for your principles. Someone whose silence carries weight because they know it's backed by standards. Someone whose no means no, not maybe, not later, not if you keep pushing. Even in moments of emotion, when people you care about challenge your lines, when you're tempted to bend them just this once, remember this: your future self will either thank you for your strength or carry the burden of your weakness. And that burden compounds. One tolerated disrespect becomes a pattern. One ignored violation becomes permission, but when you respond the first time, the pattern never forms. The lesson is immediate. The boundary becomes real. Socrates once said, "The shortest and surest way to live with honor in the world is to be in reality what we would appear to be." Boundaries make that possible, because without them, your values are just words. They're ideas you admire but don't live by. But when your boundaries are clear and enforced, your values become visible. They become part of how you move, how you speak, how you lead. And people feel that. They respond to that, not always with comfort, but always with clarity. So if you want your aura to carry weight, stop scattering it in places that don't honor it. If you want your presence to mean something, make sure your absence is felt when lines are crossed. Don't explain your standards, live them. Don't apologize for your no, stand by it. Don't fear the sting that boundaries bring, embrace it. Because it's in that sting, quiet, sharp, unforgettable, that your power is made real. Silence is not emptiness, it's not weakness, and it's certainly not the absence of thought. It's a force, a presence, a statement, and when it's used intentionally, it becomes one of the most powerful tactics in your arsenal. Most people are terrified of silence, especially in moments of pressure. They rush to fill it with noise, explanations, nervous laughter, apologies they don't mean, or arguments they haven't thought through. But the person who can sit in silence, who can hold a gaze without flinching, who can let a moment stretch without scrambling to rescue it, that person controls the room without lifting a finger. They create tension without saying a word, because silence, when wielded deliberately, reveals more than most conversations ever could. In the middle of conflict, silence exposes fragility. When you don't respond to an insult, you shine a spotlight on the insecurity of the one who threw it. When you don't rush to explain yourself, you let the weight of your presence do the talking. And when someone pushes you, expecting you to react, expecting you to fire back or lose your center, and you don't, they're left off balance, confused, maybe even intimidated. That's not manipulation. That's psychological control rooted in self-command. Because if you can stay silent in moments when most people lose their voice, you show others that your emotions aren't available for public consumption. You don't perform them on command. Carl Jung once said, "The ability to be alone with your thoughts is the foundation of all psychological strength." Silence doesn't just affect others. It shapes you. It sharpens your focus. It deepens your ability to observe. In silence, you're not reacting. You're watching. You're collecting information. You're listening to what's said and what's not. You're seeing the micro-expressions, the nervous shifts, the hesitations. You're analyzing the game while others are too busy trying to play it out loud. And when the time finally comes for you to speak, you don't talk, you strike, with clarity, with force, with intention, because your words aren't used to fill space. They're used to shift it. There's a certain kind of presence that silence amplifies. The less you say, the more people lean in. The less you react, the more they question themselves. The longer you pause, the more power your voice holds when you break it. That's why silence is not passive. It's active, strategic, surgical. It's what separates those who lead the conversation from those who chase it. And most importantly, it puts pressure where it belongs, on the person who was expecting to control you. When you don't give them the reaction they planned for, the conversation turns. Now they're wondering what you're thinking. Now they're trying to anticipate your move. Now they're feeling uncertain while you remain composed. But silence isn't just for confrontation. It's for everyday interactions too. When someone interrupts you, don't jump to reclaim your voice. Let the silence stretch. Let them sit in it. When someone asks a question that feels intrusive or manipulative, don't rush to answer. Let them feel the weight of that silence pressing back on their motives. When someone expects you to justify your choices, let the quiet do the work. People aren't used to that. They're used to noise. They're used to immediate validation, instant responses, predictable feedback loops. But silence breaks those loops. It rewrites the rhythm, and in doing so, it creates power. Marcus Aurelius said, "The more we value things outside our control, the less control we have." Silence is one of the few tools that brings control back into your hands. It disconnects you from the emotional bait others throw your way. It creates space between stimulus and response, and in that space, you decide who you want to be. You don't lash out. You don't defend. You don't crumble. You pause. You breathe. You observe. And when the moment is right, you respond, not with noise, but with precision. Some people think silence is cold, but it's not. It's honest. It's grounded. And it's one of the clearest expressions of strength, because it shows that you are not afraid of tension. You are not afraid of being misunderstood. You are not afraid to let someone else sit in the discomfort they created. That kind of calm unnerves people because it's rare, because it reveals who's actually in control, and because most people are too uncomfortable with themselves to endure a moment without distraction. But the person who has trained themselves to find clarity and stillness, that person can walk into any room, say very little, and still be the one everyone watches. Even when someone is attacking you verbally, raising their voice, trying to dominate the space, if you remain calm and quiet, something fascinating happens. They begin to question themselves. They begin to over-explain. They lose the rhythm of their attack, because silence reflects their behavior back at them. And more often than not, people don't like what they see in that mirror. Silence reveals. It doesn't need to correct. It doesn't need to punish. It simply allows the weight of truth to surface on its own. Socrates once said, "I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think." And sometimes the best way to make someone think is to stop talking. Let the silence invite their thoughts. Let it force reflection. Let it press on the parts they're trying to ignore, because that's when transformation begins, not when we're overwhelmed with information, but when we're confronted with ourselves. In your personal relationships, silence can be even more powerful. In arguments, choosing to be still instead of reactive shifts the dynamic instantly. In moments of tension, remaining grounded rather than emotional invites resolution, not escalation. You don't need to win the discussion by overpowering it. You win by not being pulled into the chaos. You win by not losing yourself. And you'll notice something else. The people who matter will start speaking differently around you. They'll think more carefully. They'll listen more intently, because they know you don't just talk to talk. You talk when it matters, and that's when they listen. But don't confuse silence with avoidance. Avoidance is rooted in fear. Silence is rooted in discipline. Avoidance is passive. Silence is active. Avoidance hides. Silence observes. When you've done the inner work, when you're no longer uncomfortable in your own stillness, silence becomes your anchor. It becomes your weapon, your strategy, your boundary. You no longer need to match someone's energy to maintain your own. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to explain yourself to be understood. You simply need to pause, hold your ground, and let the silence speak what words never could. Eventually, people begin to respect it. They learn to listen for the meaning behind your silence. They stop pushing so hard for answers. They start reflecting more. Because silence, when used with intention, teaches people how to interact with you. It sets a tone. It draws a line. It creates space for truth, for presence, for power. And in that space, you rise, not through domination, not through volume, but through command. The quiet kind that can't be ignored, the kind that makes others shift, second-guess, and sit with themselves long after the moment has passed. That is the essence of using silence as a tactic, not to hide your power, but to reveal it slowly, intentionally, and on your own terms. There's something deeply powerful about a person who doesn't chase, who isn't desperate to prove, to please, or to possess. They move differently. They speak with calm. They make decisions from clarity, not anxiety. And the reason is simple: they've detached. Not in a cold or indifferent way, but in a way that frees them from the chaos of needing constant validation. Because when you stop gripping everything so tightly, people, outcomes, approval, something surprising happens. You begin to breathe. You begin to see clearly. You begin to act with intent, not impulse. This kind of detachment isn't about not caring. It's about caring in a cleaner, more refined way. It's the difference between love and obsession, between drive and desperation. You can still want things deeply. You can still pursue goals, nurture relationships, and put effort into your life. But when you're no longer defined by those outcomes, when your worth isn't riding on their success, you regain control. You shift from being emotionally reactive to emotionally grounded. You become the eye of the storm rather than a leaf in the wind. And people notice. They're drawn to that steadiness, even if they can't explain why. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That's the essence of detachment. You're not bound by outcomes. You're defined by your direction. You show up, you give your best, and you let go. And that letting go is what grants you power, not just over your environment, but over your own mind. Because the more attached you are to a result, the more you suffer when it doesn't come. You get tossed around by highs and lows. You become addicted to what-ifs. But when you detach, you remain steady, focused, at peace. Think about how much energy we waste trying to control the uncontrollable. We overanalyze texts, obsess over reactions, read into silences, chase certainty in places where it doesn't exist. But control is an illusion. You can influence outcomes, yes, but you can't guarantee them. And once you accept that, deeply accept it, something inside you softens. You stop fighting reality. You stop forcing. And in that surrender, a different kind of strength emerges. The strength to walk away. The strength to say no. The strength to stay centered even when things fall apart around you. Detachment gives you options. You no longer act from fear of losing something, but from a place of alignment. You don't cling to relationships out of insecurity. You choose them from a place of self-respect. You don't chase opportunities because you're afraid they won't come again. You evaluate them with clarity. You don't overinvest in people who can't reciprocate because you understand your energy is sacred. And that understanding creates space. Space for better things to enter. Space for silence to speak. Space for you to hear your own voice again. But detachment isn't something that happens overnight. It's built slowly through self-awareness, through repetition, through the willingness to pause before reacting. Every time you feel yourself clinging to something, a result, a person's opinion, an identity, you stop, you breathe, you ask yourself, is this really worth my peace? And that one moment of awareness begins to shift everything. It's how you start training your mind to let go, not to give up, but to move on without bitterness, without resentment, without self-pity. That's when growth becomes inevitable. Seneca said, "He is most powerful who has power over himself." And detachment is the ultimate expression of that. When you no longer crave validation, people can't manipulate you with it. When you no longer chase approval, rejection can't control you. When you no longer fear loss, you become impossible to intimidate. That's what makes detachment magnetic. You're not needy. You're not reactive. You're whole before anyone adds to you. And that makes people curious. It makes them respect your space. It makes them treat your presence like a privilege. You'll notice something else too. When you stop chasing, the right things start arriving. Not because of magic, but because of clarity. When your mind isn't cluttered with anxious noise, you see what's actually meant for you. You're not blinded by impulse or desperation. You can tell the difference between real and fake, between aligned and distracting, and you choose differently. You move slower, you listen more, you stop rushing toward things just to escape stillness. And that's where the real transformation happens, not in the next win or next relationship, but in the way you relate to yourself. In relationships, detachment lets you love freely without controlling. You don't grip people tightly out of fear. They stay because they want to, not because you've trapped them. You give space. You let others reveal themselves without trying to edit them. You're able to handle distance, silence, even endings with grace, because your identity isn't tied to their presence. That doesn't mean you stop feeling. It means your feelings don't govern your self-worth. You can love deeply without losing yourself. That's not coldness, that's emotional maturity. Even in your ambitions, detachment is vital. The more you need to succeed, the more you sabotage yourself. Pressure turns effort into anxiety, but when you focus on the process, not the outcome, you start showing up more fully. You take risks not to impress, but to learn. You're not paralyzed by failure because you no longer see it as personal. It's just data, just direction. And when wins come, they're meaningful, but they don't define you. You're stable with or without them. That's what makes you dangerous. You're not playing for validation, you're playing for growth. Aristotle said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." And detachment begins with that knowing. When you know who you are without the noise, without the applause, without the constant chase, you move from truth, you live from strength, you speak from clarity, and people respond to that, not always with admiration, sometimes with discomfort, but always with attention, because groundedness is rare. In a world that's constantly screaming for more attention, more likes, more proof, you're choosing less noise, less drama, less dependence, and that silence, that stillness, becomes your advantage. Detachment doesn't mean you don't feel, it means you feel everything, but you're not consumed by anything. You observe without absorbing, you experience without attaching. You care deeply, but you're not defined by outcomes. That gives you room to breathe, to pivot, to rebuild without collapse. Life becomes less about control, more about direction, less about proving, more about becoming. And that shift, it changes everything. It turns struggle into strategy. It turns pain into power. It turns the ordinary into something intentional. Eventually, you reach a place where your peace is no longer negotiable, where your boundaries are clear, where your energy doesn't go to chasing, convincing, or over-explaining. You start to attract people, opportunities, and experiences that mirror that same emotional discipline. And the rest, you simply let go, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with calm, with gratitude, with a quiet confidence that whatever is meant to stay will never need to be forced, and whatever doesn't, wasn't meant to carry you forward. That's the real power of detachment. You stop being a prisoner of your expectations. You become the author of your energy. And when your peace is no longer at the mercy of people or outcomes, you become unshakable. Not because you have everything, but because you need nothing to feel whole. And that, more than anything, is what sets you apart. Most people give too much, too fast. They hand out their time, energy, and approval as if they're trying to earn a place in the world, as if validation is a form of currency they need to spend in bulk just to be accepted. But the truth is, When you give everything away easily, it starts to mean less. Your compliments feel routine, your attention feels cheap, and slowly, without even realizing it, your presence becomes background noise, noticed maybe, but never truly valued. Strategic generosity flips that script. You don't give to be liked. You give to shift the balance of power. When you understand the weight of your attention, you stop scattering it. You stop smiling just to ease the tension. You stop giving compliments that aren't rooted in truth. You start choosing moments with precision. And that precision builds gravity. It makes people lean in when you speak. It makes them second-guess their value when you don't, because what you offer is no longer assumed. It's earned. It's not about being cold or manipulative. It's about moving with intention, about understanding that when you're selective with your approval, your presence begins to carry authority. Carl Jung once said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." And when it comes to generosity, that applies. You don't talk about being kind or supportive. You simply act, but rarely. Not because you're withholding, but because you understand that the less you offer, the more impact it carries. That one compliment from you, when it finally lands, feels like recognition. That one small gesture, when it finally arrives, feels like a gift. Because it's not driven by need, it's driven by clarity. You didn't give because you had to. You gave because it meant something. Most people give as a way to prove their goodness, to win favor, to avoid rejection. They mistake generosity for insurance. But power doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being respected. And respect is earned not through excess, but through restraint. When you know the value of your words, you speak less. When you know the power of your energy, you protect it. And when you understand the psychology behind approval, you begin to wield yours like a scalpel, not a spray hose. You carve meaning into every gesture and people feel it. There's a certain tension that builds when someone never quite knows where they stand with you. When you don't always praise them, when you don't always react, when you don't always smile. That tension creates awareness. It forces people to calibrate their behavior, to self-correct, to perform at their best, not for applause, but because your approval is rare enough to be pursued. And that pursuit is powerful. It keeps you in a position where others are thinking about you, even when you're silent. They replay your words, they seek your feedback, they crave your validation. Not because you begged for influence, but because you rationed it. Strategic generosity also protects your integrity. When you're not constantly giving, you're less likely to overextend yourself. You're less likely to betray your own needs just to satisfy others. You're not saying yes out of guilt. You're not giving compliments you don't mean. You're not sacrificing your peace just to keep the mood light. You give when it aligns with your values. You support when it's deserved. You share your presence when it's intentional. And in that selectiveness, you reinforce your standards, not just for others, but for yourself. Aristotle once said, "To give away money is an easy matter, but to decide to whom to give it, and how large and when, and for what purpose and how, is neither in every man's power nor an easy matter." Replace money with energy, attention, kindness, and the truth remains. Strategic generosity isn't about withholding. It's about elevation, about giving in a way that lifts, that transforms, that disrupts patterns. It's the difference between a performance and an impact. And people can feel the difference even if they can't name it. The danger of giving too much is that people begin to expect it. And once something becomes expected, it loses its edge. Think about the people in your life who are always available, always complimentary, always giving. You appreciate them, yes, but do you crave their words? Do you study their silences? Probably not. Now think about someone whose praise is rare, whose presence is limited. When they speak, you listen. When they compliment, you remember. Because it breaks the pattern, it feels earned, and earned attention always hits different. Strategic generosity also disrupts power dynamics. Most people are so eager to give that they hand over their leverage. They compliment someone who doesn't respect them. They overextend for people who wouldn't do the same. But when you give from a place of self-respect, not need, you control the frame. You become the person whose opinion is sought, not because you flatter, but because your words are scarce and sincere. You don't need to say much, you only need to mean it. And when that's the case, silence becomes its own kind of influence. It's not about being cold, it's about being conscious. There's a difference. Strategic generosity doesn't come from a closed heart. It comes from a clear one. You're not trying to win anyone over. You're not trying to earn love. You're offering value in a way that respects your own boundaries, in a way that creates gravity, not just noise. You smile when you feel like it. You give when it's right. You recognize effort when it deserves it. And the rest? You keep it to yourself, not as punishment, but as power, as precision, as protection. Seneca once wrote, "No man was ever wise by chance. Wisdom takes discipline, so does generosity. Anyone can pour their energy into others, but it takes real self-awareness to give without losing yourself. It takes restraint to hold back when it's easier to please. It takes strength to be the person whose approval isn't automatic. And that strength creates a different kind of intimacy, one built not on constant access, but on earned moments. Moments people don't forget. Moments that actually shift how they see themselves. In the end, you want to be remembered, not because you were always available, but because you were intentional. Not because you gave everything, but because what you gave mattered. You don't need to flatter people into liking you. You don't need to buy affection with over-the-top praise or self-sacrifice. You need to be grounded enough to let people work for your attention, to let silence do some of the speaking, to let the weight of your presence be felt in the spaces between your actions. There's nothing arrogant about being strategic with your energy. It's not manipulation, it's self-respect. You're not here to be everyone's favorite. You're here to be someone's unforgettable turning point. And that doesn't happen through excess. It happens through clarity, through knowing when to give and when to pull back, through trusting that your presence is already enough, and that giving less, when done right, always ends up meaning more. Power doesn't always show up with noise. Sometimes it enters a room without making a sound. No threat, no outburst, no grand display. Just a presence that shifts the energy. A quiet weight that people feel, even if they can't explain it. It's not about intimidation. It's about awareness. It's about the subtle psychological tension you create when people sense that your silence holds consequences. That if they step too far, something will shift, and not in their favor. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to carry yourself like someone who doesn't have to. That's the paradox of presence. The people who seem the calmest often hold the deepest power. Because they're not reacting. They're observing. They're calculating. And that unknown, what you might do, what you might say, what line you might draw, that unknown becomes more powerful than any visible reaction. When people aren't sure what your silence means, they tread more carefully. They second-guess their tone. They start considering outcomes they would have ignored if you were loud and predictable. Psychological tension lives in that uncertainty. It's not about playing games or being manipulative. It's about building an emotional atmosphere where your value is felt, where your withdrawal feels like loss, where your attention feels like privilege. You don't need to constantly defend yourself because your aura already sets boundaries. You don't need to repeat your standards because the way you carry yourself enforces them. That's the real power, not the punishment, but the pressure. Not what you've done, but what they think you could do if you decided they were no longer worth your energy. When you need nothing, you become unpredictable. When you're whole without others, your distance becomes threatening. Not because you intend harm, but because your silence means something. It signals that you're thinking, that you're measuring, that maybe, just maybe, they crossed a line they didn't see coming. We're conditioned to believe that confrontation must be loud to be effective, that you need to raise your voice, slam the door, send the angry text. But there's another way, one that leaves a deeper imprint. When someone crosses a boundary and you simply go quiet, when you don't flinch, don't beg, don't explain, when you remove your presence without fanfare, it disorients them. Because they expected chaos, but instead they get absence, stillness, and it eats at them. They wonder what you're thinking. They wonder what's coming. They wonder if they've just lost access to something they didn't even know they depended on. That's how tension works. It's the subtle tightening in the air when something isn't being said. When you look someone in the eye and hold your words. When you pause for just a second longer than usual. That second is everything. It makes people reflect. It makes them question themselves. It shifts the control from external to internal. They're no longer reacting to you. They're reacting to their own mind, to the possibility of consequences that haven't yet arrived. And those imagined consequences are almost always more powerful than the real ones. Epictetus wrote, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." But sometimes the most powerful reaction is none at all. A well-placed silence, a still look, a quiet walk away, because people remember how you made them feel more than what you said. And when someone senses that your peace has limits, that your patience has depth, but also edges, they'll think twice before pushing further. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect made visible. And when you live like this, your reputation builds itself. You don't need to spread stories. You don't need to correct the record. You don't need to defend your name in every room. People will do it for you, because they've seen the way you enforce standards without ever raising your voice. They've watched how others adjust their behavior around you. And they know, whether they say it or not, that your silence isn't empty. It's charged. It's intentional. It has history behind it. And that's enough to create space where others rush in too fast. Even the fear of your disappointment can become a force. When people respect you, they don't want to see your expression shift. They don't want to feel your absence. They don't want to lose the lightness of being in your good graces. And so, they behave differently. Not because you demanded it, but because you created an emotional economy where your attention has weight and your silence has consequence. And that kind of tension, it becomes a constant undercurrent, one that keeps your boundaries intact without constant reminders. Plato once said, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." But real power, in many ways, is restraint. It's the ability to stay calm when you could explode, to hold the silence when you could lash out, to walk away when you could stay and teach a lesson. Because when your presence alone teaches it, when your withdrawal speaks volumes, there's no need for theatrics. There's just clarity, quiet, and the echo of what wasn't said, which often lands harder than any words ever could. You don't need to make people afraid of you. You only need them to be unsure what your next move might be. That alone changes everything. It makes them evaluate their behavior. It makes them reframe their assumptions. It makes them approach with care. And that care builds respect. Organic, unspoken, but undeniable. The kind that doesn't need rules taped to the wall. It's enforced by the air around you, by the pauses between your words, by the fact that you carry consequences like a shadow, always behind you, never seen, but always felt. So much of psychological power isn't about dominance. It's about ambiguity. When people can't quite read you, when they can't predict your next move, when they feel like your attention could vanish at any moment, they start treating it as something precious. They start managing their tone. They start respecting your time. They start questioning if they're even worth your response. And that hesitation, that slight pause before they speak to you, that's the echo of the tension you've created. Seneca once noted, "He who is brave is free." And freedom, in this case, is the ability to respond how and when you choose, not out of compulsion, but out of clarity. You don't need to follow their script. You don't need to match their emotion. You move when it makes sense. You speak when you've decided it's worth it. And that patience, that control, creates a gravity people feel long after you've left the room. Let your silence hold your standards. Let your pauses speak for your boundaries. Let the mystery of your restraint do the heavy lifting. Because when people can't predict you, they can't control you. And when they can't control you, they learn to respect you, or they distance themselves. Either way, the energy protects itself. You don't need to be feared, you need to be felt. And when your presence carries quiet tension, when your stillness hints at depth, people will treat you accordingly, not because you demanded it, but because they've learned, through experience, that losing your respect comes at a cost they're not sure they can afford. And that, more than anything, is what keeps your peace intact in a world that constantly tries to disrupt it. The most powerful people aren't necessarily the loudest or the most charismatic. They're often the ones who do what they say every time, the ones who don't shift with the mood of the room, the ones who don't rise and fall with external approval. They walk into a space and you know exactly what to expect, not because they're boring, but because they're grounded. Their consistency builds a kind of gravity. It anchors them, and it quietly pulls others in. People trust it, because in a world full of uncertainty, a steady presence is magnetic. When you're consistent, you become a reference point. Others use you to measure themselves. They notice your discipline. They recognize your emotional steadiness. And over time, that steadiness becomes its own form of dominance. You don't need to dominate the conversation. You don't need to outshine or outperform. Your consistency creates a silent authority, and that authority builds influence because people are drawn to what doesn't flinch under pressure. They want to be around someone who doesn't break when things get heavy, someone who holds the line, not for attention, but because it's who they are. It's easy to be intense in short bursts, to show up strong for a week, a project, a moment. But that fades. Anyone can make an impact once. What really changes people, what shapes perception, is who you are over time. When your standards remain high, even when no one's watching, when your reactions don't fluctuate based on who you're with, when your values show up in every environment, not just the ones that benefit you, that's consistency. And it doesn't go unnoticed. There's something unnerving about someone who never wavers. You can argue with them, push them, try to get a rise, but they stay grounded. They don't overreact. They don't over-explain. They don't perform. They just remain. And that calm, that sense of being centered, makes them incredibly difficult to manipulate, because the more consistent you are, the harder you are to move. You're no longer swayed by moods, guilt, or flattery. Your boundaries aren't up for discussion. Your peace isn't negotiable, and your time isn't handed out just because someone demands it. Consistency is clarity, and clarity gives you leverage. When people know where you stand, they can't twist your words. They can't pretend they misunderstood. They can't play the "I didn't know" game, because your actions have been clear, your expectations have been visible, and your patterns don't lie. This doesn't mean you're rigid. It means you're reliable. It means your core doesn't shift just to fit the room. You adapt, sure, but your center doesn't move, and that makes people take you seriously. Eventually, you become the frame, in conversation, in conflict, in connection. Others follow your lead, not because you asked, but because you earned it. They trust you to be the one who won't fold, the one who won't disappear, the one who doesn't just react but reflects. And when you hold the frame, you hold the power, because power isn't about control over others, it's about mastery over yourself. And when you've mastered your reactions, your discipline, and your emotional tone, you become unshakable. That unshakability is felt. It enters the room before you speak. It's in the way you listen without rushing to respond. It's in the way you show up even when it's inconvenient. It's in the way you remain calm when others panic. And it teaches people how to treat you. It tells them, this person doesn't tolerate disrespect. This person doesn't chase. This person doesn't flinch when provoked. And that knowledge, that memory of your consistency, shapes how they engage with you. It creates distance where needed. It fosters respect where none existed. And it builds a quiet authority that doesn't need a title to be recognized. You stop having to defend yourself when your pattern has already done it for you. You stop explaining your values when your actions reflect them so clearly. And you stop seeking validation when your consistency has already created your identity. People believe you when you've shown them enough proof. Not once, not twice, but again and again. That's how reputations are built. That's how trust is earned. That's how legacy is formed, not by intensity, but by repetition. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." And that's the essence of consistency. Stop talking, stop promising, just be. Be the person who acts on principle. Be the person who shows up regardless of mood. Be the person whose word holds weight because their actions have always matched. And over time, you become immovable. Not stubborn, but solid. Not unbending, but unwavering. A force of nature that doesn't need to explain itself to be understood. Inconsistency fractures your power. It sends mixed signals. It creates doubt. People don't know how to treat you because you don't know how to treat yourself. One day you're disciplined, the next you're distracted. One moment you're kind, the next you're reactive. And slowly, your words start to lose weight. Your presence starts to lose pull. Because no one follows what's unpredictable. No one trusts a map that changes every day. No one relies on someone who might not be the same person tomorrow. But when you're consistent, people orient themselves around you. They begin to factor you in. They plan with you in mind. Because you're not a variable, you're a constant. That's rare, that's valuable, and it creates influence that doesn't need to be forced. Influence that flows, because people feel safer around someone who's the same in storms and sunshine, who's calm under pressure, who's aligned from word to action. You become the person people go to when things fall apart. Not because you fix everything, but because you don't crumble. Your energy tells them, we'll figure it out. Not with panic, not with drama, but with clarity, with grounded presence, with structure. And that stability becomes a lighthouse, something others can see from far away, something they move toward, something that brings them home to themselves. There's power in being consistent. Not just external power, the ability to influence others, but internal power, the ability to rely on yourself, to wake up knowing who you are, to move through life without having to rediscover your values every time you're challenged. Consistency isn't about perfection, it's about direction. It's about being intentional even when you're tired. It's about making the choice, again and again, to honor who you said you'd be, even when no one's looking, especially when no one's looking. That's what builds real confidence, not hype, not compliments, but the quiet knowing that you've shown up again, that you didn't break your own word, that your reflection at night matches the person you aimed to be that morning. And that kind of confidence radiates. It doesn't boast, It doesn't shout, it just is. And people feel it, even if they can't name it, even if they can't explain why they respect you more now than before. They just do. Because in a world where everyone's changing masks to fit the room, the one who remains whole is unforgettable, and their presence becomes not just admired, but depended on. And from that place, real leadership is born, not from dominance, not from noise, but from the consistent expression of self-mastery. One choice at a time, one standard at a time, one day at a time. The strongest respect you'll ever receive doesn't come from others, it comes from yourself. Not in the form of praise or affirmation, but in the quiet, unseen choices you make when no one is watching. It's easy to pretend strength in public, to speak with confidence, to walk with presence, to act like you've got it all figured out. But the real test is in the silence, when the world isn't looking, when the applause is gone, when it's just you and your reflection. What you do in those moments is what shapes the way others feel your presence, not because you demand respect, but because you embody it. Ruthless self-respect begins where excuses end. It starts when you stop negotiating with yourself about the same things you swore you'd change. It begins when you treat your time like it matters, your energy like it's limited, and your habits like they're sacred. Most people betray themselves before the world ever gets the chance. They let laziness slide. They give themselves permission to break promises to themselves. They treat personal standards like suggestions instead of laws. And then they wonder why no one takes them seriously, why their words don't carry weight, why their presence feels light. But when you build discipline behind closed doors, it leaks into everything. It sharpens your tone, it straightens your posture, it gives your silence gravity. People can feel when you've trained yourself not to flinch, when you've mastered the urge to explain, to overgive, to seek validation. That mastery doesn't come from books or speeches or advice. It comes from war with yourself. It comes from staring down your own weakness, your own cravings, your own moments of self-betrayal, and choosing differently, again and again, until it's no longer a fight, until it's who you are. Respect isn't about pride. It's not about puffing your chest or demanding better treatment. It's about boundaries, quiet, unwavering boundaries, the kind that don't need to be shouted because they're so obvious in how you live. When you respect yourself, your actions change. You don't chase people who are careless with your energy. You don't explain your worth to someone who's already shown they don't see it. You don't bend over backward to keep the peace when your soul is screaming for you to stand still. Your silence becomes louder than their noise. But becoming who you are requires burning away everything you're not. And that process isn't glamorous, it's brutal, it's lonely. It's full of nights where your only company is the guilt of almost falling back into who you used to be. But if you stay there, if you endure that discomfort long enough to rebuild your habits, your mindset, your sense of self, you walk out of that fire untouchable. Not because you're perfect, but because you've seen the parts of yourself that tried to sabotage your future and you didn't flinch. You met them with honesty, with patience, with unshakable self-respect. You stop negotiating with procrastination. You stop justifying weakness disguised as self-care. You stop making room for anything that insults the future version of you that you're trying to become. And that shift, the one no one sees, is what makes your presence feel different. Because there's a seriousness behind your eyes now, not in a harsh way, but in a grounded, immovable way. People feel it, even if they can't describe it. They treat you differently without knowing why. They watch their words around you. They measure their energy. Because you're not someone to play with. You're someone who has paid the price for their peace. Self-respect builds slowly, but it collapses quickly. Every time you ignore your gut, you chip away at your integrity. Every time you tolerate laziness, you weaken your frame. Every time you let yourself off the hook, you dull the edge that used to make you sharp. And the cost of that is higher than you think, because the world doesn't give you what you ask for. It gives you what you settle for, what you signal you'll accept. And that signal is loudest in how you treat yourself. You can't lead others if you're still lying to yourself. You can't expect loyalty if you're still betraying your own vision. You can't ask for respect if you're still operating in ways that erode it. The person who walks into a room and commands attention isn't the loudest. It's the one who doesn't need anything from anyone. The one who's already full. The one who has already looked in the mirror and handled their business. That's power. And it's quiet. It's not in your tone. It's in your patterns. It's not in what you post. It's in what you practice. You stop proving yourself because your life already proves your standards. You stop over-explaining because your actions already speak for you. You stop tolerating confusion in your relationships because you've eliminated it in your inner world. And that clarity, that refusal to tolerate internal chaos, is what makes you feel like a different force entirely. People can sense when you're aligned, when your words match your energy, when your time has a cost, when your space is sacred, and they act accordingly. Socrates once said, "The greatest way to live with honor in this world is to be what we pretend to be." And most people are pretending to be focused, pretending to be driven, pretending to be confident. But you can't fake the weight of someone who's done the work, the kind of work that no one claps for, the kind of work that doesn't show up on social media, the kind of work that only reveals itself in pressure, when the moment comes, and it always comes, where you're forced to choose between who you were and who you said you wanted to be. That's when you find out whether you've built self-respect or just talked about it. So look at your habits. Look at your morning routine. Look at your distractions. Look at your response to rejection, to failure, to boredom. Are you honoring the standard, or are you finding reasons to fall below it? That's the test. Not the one life gives you, but the one you give yourself, every day, in the smallest decisions, because if you don't enforce your standards when it's inconvenient, they're not standards, they're preferences. And preferences don't build power. Discipline does. You begin to see your time differently, your space differently, your silence differently. You stop offering pieces of yourself to people who haven't earned them. You stop accepting crumbs of attention from people you would have once moved mountains for. Because now you see yourself clearly. And when you see yourself clearly, the world either rises to meet you or it falls away. Both are victories. Both are forms of self-respect. This isn't about becoming hard. It's about becoming honest. Honest about your limits. Honest about your energy. Honest about the habits that keep you stuck. You start saying no, not to punish others, but to protect your momentum. You start choosing solitude over shallow company. You start trading short-term pleasure for long-term peace. And you realize that the people who truly respect you never need to be convinced. They recognize the work you've done by how you carry yourself, how you move, how you don't chase, don't beg, don't explain. You just keep rising. That rise is slow, it's not glamorous, but it's real. And the more you enforce that internal standard, the more your external world rearranges around it. People either rise with you or they reveal why they can't. Either way, you don't bend. Because this isn't about proving you're better. It's about proving to yourself, day after day, that you're not going back. That the version of you who tolerated less, accepted less, became less, is gone. And what remains is someone who has earned every ounce of the silence, peace, and respect they now carry. At some point, your growth becomes irreversible. You've stopped pretending. The persona you once had to construct out of discipline and discomfort slowly becomes your second skin. The posture, the focus, The silence that once took effort now arise without thought. It's no longer about performance. You've internalized the standards so deeply that even on your worst day, you won't drop below them. And this is where the shift begins, not in what you say or how you appear, but in how the world starts to move around you. There's a weight to you now, a kind of gravity that doesn't scream for attention, but commands it by its mere existence. The most magnetic people aren't the ones chasing attention. They're the ones who've outgrown the need for it. You stop trying to make noise because your presence speaks louder in silence. It's not that you've become colder, it's that you've become clearer. And when you're clear, you don't flinch. You don't over-explain. You don't reach. The world either recognizes you or it reveals that it's not ready. Either way, your direction stays the same. The difference now is, people feel it. They feel that resistance is pointless, that arguing with your path is like arguing with gravity. So they adjust. They follow, not because they're being pulled, but because your presence leaves no room for anything else. Inevitability isn't something you declare. It's something you become, slowly. Through 1,000 private victories, through the repetition of difficult choices, through the practice of restraint when ego screams for indulgence. Most people try to dominate through noise, through arguments, through ego, through performance. But you rise by being undeniable, by being the one who keeps moving, by becoming the standard others compare themselves to, not because you said so, but because it's obvious. Your actions build the reputation. Your discipline becomes the proof. Your results do the talking. There's something about a person who has nothing to prove but everything to protect, their peace, their principles, their direction. You stop trying to convince people to understand you. You stop needing them to agree with your values. Because you're no longer navigating through their expectations, you've become the terrain. And the terrain doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it just is. People either learn to walk it or they get lost. That's inevitability. That's the quiet power of someone who's done the inner work without needing applause. And over time, what you do becomes your identity, not the goals you talk about, but the standards you live by. Not the confidence you perform, but the boundaries you hold. It's this consistency that makes you feel inevitable, not because you're the loudest voice in the room, but because you're the one who shows up the same regardless of who's watching. When people see that, they don't question your path, they start questioning theirs. You don't lead with pressure. You lead with presence. This is where you stop chasing alignment and start attracting it. Not through charisma, but through clarity. People sense that you're not movable by trends, not shaken by opinions, not desperate for approval. And that stillness, it draws them in. It's not charm, it's certainty. You've figured out who you are, and now you walk like it. You talk like it. You choose like it. And without even meaning to, you start rearranging the atmosphere around you. Others start speaking differently, acting differently, not because you told them to, but because your example made anything less feel out of place. You become the quiet voice that echoes longer than the loud ones. The presence people think about days later. The standard they compare their own to. Not because you asked to be remembered, but because your consistency made forgetting you impossible. That's the power of inevitability. You don't force doors open. You walk like someone who already belongs on the other side. And eventually the door opens, not because you knocked harder, but because it couldn't ignore you any longer. There's no arrogance in this. Only refinement, a slow sharpening of the soul. You keep removing what's unnecessary. You let go of urgency, of noise, of anything that pulls you away from your center. And in that quiet, your energy compounds, your patience grows, your vision deepens. You stop reacting, you start guiding, not just others, but yourself, with precision, with care, with unshakable confidence that doesn't need to be declared out loud. Eventually, people don't just see your growth, they expect it. They adjust to your evolution, or they drift away. You stop chasing potential in others, and you become the proof of it. You stop needing to be understood, and you focus on being aligned. And that alignment, it becomes your armor, your compass, your quiet weapon. When you're inevitable, you don't need to be liked, praised, or celebrated. You just need to keep showing up, keep refining, keep building a life that speaks before you do. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. That habit of thinking clearly, moving deliberately, living with discipline, creates a rhythm so steady it becomes music in a world full of noise. And that music stays with people, even after you've left the room, even after the conversation ends. You're not just remembered, you're felt. Because you didn't just speak, you embodied. The moment you become inevitable is the moment you no longer need validation to continue. You move with a calm force. You don't panic. You don't explain. You act, and the world adjusts. You walk into rooms, and the temperature shifts. Not because you're trying to dominate, but because you're grounded. And grounded people don't chase storms. They become the stillness that everything else has to bend around. So, refine your standards, eliminate your noise, commit to your pace, your path, your process, and do it without flinching, do it without waiting for applause, because the day you become inevitable is the day you realize the game was never about being seen. It was about becoming so clear, so steady, so rooted in your truth that being ignored was no longer possible. That's power, quiet, lasting, unshakable, yours. The world bends to those who move without doubt. Become so rooted in who you are that no one can overlook you without feeling the weight of what they missed. Keep refining, keep rising. And when you're ready for more, one of these videos will take you even deeper. And thank you, truly, for being a part of Stoic Journal.